Welcome, everyone. I know we still have people joining us. Thank you for joining our TALAHour. We are very excited to have Paul Jarvis with Clarent here today with us to talk about performance data that's collected at the community level and how that's looked at by folks in the home office, the regional office. And so that is obviously something that's very key to executive directors, understanding how that data is interpreted. Paul has been one of our industry partners for several years now. We're so excited about the support that we get from our industry partners and also the information that we can share with y'all that is pertinent to you. And so with that, we've just got really one housekeeping rule. Since this is a webinar, you won't be on camera, but if you have a question, please use the chat function to ask questions, and we'll get those as we go along if the flow permits, and if not, we'll take those all at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul to introduce himself some more.
Wonderful. Thank you, Diana, and thank you everybody for taking the time to come be with me. I know it's Friday of a long weekend, so I appreciate everyone very much. My name is Paul Jarvis. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Clarent. We do business intelligence for senior living owners and operators. So basically what that means is we work with everyone from EDs to executives and REITs on how to pull data together out of different systems and use it to make informed decisions to run better communities and better portfolios. A little bit about myself personally. I live in Houston. I am not a native Texan. I come from Connecticut. My wife is from Houston. So we've been down here a couple of years, really like it, but definitely getting used to it and really enjoying it so far. So I'm excited to visit with you all today and talk about how to use data at the community level, but also we spend a lot of time talking not just to operators and community teams, but also to REITs and private equity about how they view community performance. So today's presentation is kind of a 360 view of community performance, the key metrics, and hopefully give you a little bit of context on how do kind of the people maybe a couple layers above you or not in your building view your performance and think about your community. So if you give me a second, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All righty. So like I mentioned, what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about kind of how is community performance measured. Essentially, how do senior living executives as well as owners and investors think about performance? What are the metrics that they use? What are the tools or kind of methods of analysis that they use? We're going to dive into some of the top KPIs, so specific metrics, and we'll explain all those as well. And then we do have some time for questions, and Diana will help me kind of figure out, is it right to do questions in the middle of it or during the presentation? So if you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'd love to have this be a conversation and answer any questions that you do have. A little bit about me. You can see my email, our website. We post kind of a weekly thing about specific metrics or different types of analysis for senior living, both on our website and on our LinkedIn. A little bit about my background kind of professionally. Prior to starting this company, I spent 7 years doing big data analysis for Fortune 500 companies. So I worked with an oil company, a bank, a pharmaceutical company, and basically we take the same principles and we apply them to senior living. And that's what we do here at Clarent. All right, so let's get into the fun stuff. So measuring performance. You know, everybody spends a lot of time making reports. It seems like all of your different systems have different reports. Your bosses, your coworkers, your direct reports, they probably ask for reports. And so this is kind of the starting point, is like, how do the people above you, whether it's your RDOs, the executives, the investors, the owners, how do they think about kind of what reports are they getting? What data are they asking for? That's where we wanted to start with. So if you're an executive director, it's important to think about who is looking at your community. And it's the RDOs, the executives at your company, also the investors and the owners. And these come in different flavors. You have REITs, private equity, independent investors. There are also other executive directors who are likely looking at performance, and they're looking at it as a benchmark for their own performance. So saying, if we run similar properties or we're in a similar geography, what are they doing in terms of occupancy over there? How are they pricing? And that informs how other people then think about their own analysis and their own performance. And now we're starting to get a little bit deeper, which is essentially, everybody looks at data, everybody thinks about performance. What do they actually do with it, right? If you're submitting information or your boss is asking for numbers, where does all that go and how is it being considered? So there's a lot of different ways, and we'll kind of go through each of these because they're a little bit different depending on who you are and the type of question that it's trying to answer. So the first one is reviewing KPIs. This is pretty straightforward, but essentially what it means is the person is looking at the numbers and saying, okay, here's the occupancy month over month, here's the move-ins, move-outs. They're just looking at the numbers and looking at historical trends. The next piece is budgets versus actuals. And this kind of gets into the question of, I like to say that one of the main uses of data is answering the question, am I doing a good job? And one of the ways that people try to do that is they compare the budget. So what did you hope to achieve as your goals versus the actual numbers that you achieved? Similar to a budget, but slightly different, is what's called a pro forma. So a pro forma are essentially the goals that were set out by the investors at the time of the purchase. So they said, we're buying this community. We believe that we can get it up to 90% occupancy and make this level of NOI within this certain amount of time. So it's similar to a budget, but it was set at the time of the purchase. You also have industry benchmarks. So you could think of things like NICMAP or data that Argentum or TALA publish that say, here's what we're seeing across communities in a certain demographic or at a certain price point or care level. So that's another way that there may be comparisons going on. If they're saying, all of the independent living communities within the San Antonio metro area are 85% occupied, for example. Then within a portfolio, operators will often stack rank communities against each other. And they may stack rank based on a number of different KPIs. And this is where being really precise on the data and making sure that you're comparing apples to apples is super important. So if you think about, a larger community is much more likely to use more labor hours per month than a smaller community that has fewer residents or fewer units. That makes sense. So if you just look at the number of labor hours, okay, obviously this community is using more. But if you look at it labor hours per resident day or labor hours per occupied unit, and essentially you normalize or you control for the level of occupancy, then you're kind of comparing apples to apples. Another great example of this is if you're looking at expenses. A larger building with more people is naturally going to incur more expenses in absolute terms, but again, on a per occupied unit or on a per resident day basis, you would expect it to be a little bit more similar. So this is the way that typically RDOs or home office executives are doing this analysis, is they'll be saying, okay, I want to pull in all this data. I'm comparing it versus budgets. I'm comparing it versus pro formas. I'm looking at these industry benchmarks. I'm stack ranking it versus other properties. And then the last piece is historical trends. So how were you doing a year ago, 2 years ago? I know that given the past few years, some of these trends may not actually be relatively useful because everything is changing so much year over year. But it is a really useful way to look back and say, a year ago, I was at this level occupancy. And now a year later, we're over here. So we're making progress. So that's just a preview of, there are lots of different ways that people try to look at information, but really all of them come back to that same question of, am I doing a good job? And where do I think that there is opportunity to get better? Or what do I think that good really looks like? Like, what is a reasonable goal that we should be able to achieve based on all the information that I'm seeing? So As I mentioned at the beginning, we're lucky enough to work not only with operators, but we also work with owners and investors. And a few months ago, a very smart lady at one of the owners that we work with explained that this is essentially how she goes through community performance. And so I kind of want to walk through this flow chart left to right and explain how you can kind of pick these pieces apart, and how to think about your own business if you were to put on kind of the owner or investor hat and say, okay, I'm not in the community day to day. I'm looking at it as a chart of accounts, or I'm looking at it as a spreadsheet. Because that's essentially what's happening, right? When someone is several layers removed from the building, they may not even be involved in the operator or the management company. The community gets kind of reduced to a set of KPIs or a set of spreadsheets that tell a story. Obviously, it's not the whole story, but it's important that you consider how that story is interpreted. So the starting point is always NOI. If you're an investor, if you're an owner, it's a business, it comes down to net operating income. If you feel like the NOI is where it should be, based on the pro forma or the budget or a couple of the different analysis tools that we talked about just now, you may say, great, I'm not going to spend that much time on this building because I own many other buildings and I'm going to pay attention there. If you do feel that the NOI is not where it needs to be, you start to dig in. And this is where it kind of goes through like a decision tree, or I always joke kind of like a choose your own adventure book. So NOI is a function of revenue minus expenses. So it might be a revenue problem. If it's revenue, the first place to look would be occupancy. If you have low occupancy, is it because your residents are leaving, or is it because you're not signing up new residents and getting move-ins? So is it because you're losing or you're not gaining fast enough? If you do have high occupancy, then that would suggest that perhaps there is a discounting challenge. Either you're not charging enough, your rates aren't correct for the level of service that you're providing or the expenses that you're accruing, or perhaps you're not collecting on your invoices. So there's a couple more places that you could go from there. If the top line side of the business looks good, then the next place you would look at would be the expenses. And as we know, labor can be 60% plus of your expenses. Particularly these days, labor is quite expensive. So that would be where you would dig in. And agency, as it's 2 times essentially full-time labor cost, you could start there and say, okay, am I spending a lot on agency or overtime, time and a half roughly? Am I spending too much on overtime? And if it is overtime or agency, what's causing it? Is it employee turnover? Because if I can't retain the employees that I have, and I can't consistently hire new employees, then obviously I need to use other labor sources to fill the gap, even if they're more expensive. So that's kind of how you navigate through this decision tree. And the thing that's interesting about something like this is it looks really simple. It makes a lot of sense when you walk through it, but we all know that real life is complicated. And to look at this type of data, you'd have to pull from a few different places. You'd have to look at your CRM, your rent roll, your payroll system, your employee turnover database. So there's a lot of information that's not really easy to go through. And I'll share kind of one anecdote. I showed this to the CFO of a large operator and said, hey, does this look right? And he said, yep, this pretty much describes our business, yet we still managed to make it harder than this. He actually used a little bit more colorful language that I won't really repeat, but that's the point, is like, this is the way that an owner is going to think is, they may not know that there was a case of COVID at the community. And so all of the staff had to sit out sick for a week or two. And so you had to spend money on agency to fill that gap. What they're seeing is just a chart of accounts or numbers in a spreadsheet. And this is how they're going to go through it piece by piece to say, is this community performing at the level that I expected relative to the budget or the pro forma? So Diana, I'll pause there. This might be a good moment to answer any questions about the kind of decision-making or performance evaluation process before we dive into the specific KPIs that are being measured.
Anyone have any questions? So far, they've been limited to, are we going to get the materials and recording?
Okay, the answer is yes, we'll definitely do that.
I don't think we have any questions right now, Paul.
Okay, great. Well, then we'll spend some time going a little bit deeper into the specific KPIs. So this is building on a presentation that I gave at the TALA conference a couple months ago. Great conference. TALA does an awesome job with events, where we talked about what are the top KPIs at a community level that EDs may want to pay attention to. And so I'm going to walk through those a little bit more. I actually expanded on them since then with more of kind of a real estate or investor mindset to complement what we just talked about in terms of how owners and investors are looking at your community. And again, we will send all this out. So this list of KPIs plus the detailed definitions of each KPI, we'll get into that as we go. Average daily census. So as we know, there are lots of different ways to measure occupancy. You could talk about census, you can talk about occupancy on a unit basis. We suggest using average daily census because it's an average over a time frame. So if you start the month with 50 residents and you end the month with 70 residents, the description, like the most accurate measure of how occupied you were during that month, is probably an average over the month. This number also drives a bunch of other KPIs within your business. So because we're talking about census and we may be including second residents, rather than just measuring the number of units that are rented, this will have a factor on controllable operating expenses. So think about like how much food do you need to order on a regular basis. So your ADC, your average daily census, can be really important in thinking about PRDs, expenses per resident day, your spend downs, as well as just thinking about occupancy. Occupancy rate is kind of the other flavor of that. It's not thinking about the number of people in the community. It's thinking about, of the available units, what percentage of them are rented. From an investor perspective or a real estate perspective, again, an investor is not thinking about the people who live in a community. They're thinking about the performance of the business. And so the performance of the business, this is going to be the metric that they spend almost all their time thinking about. If we think back to that flow chart from NOI, probably the next place they would look is occupancy and aiming for it to be above a certain percentage. Because really, for a lot of investors, many of their assumptions about how they can be successful in senior living hinge on, okay, we need to have at least a certain percentage of occupancy because that powers the bottom line. It fuels your growth. It makes sure that you have happy customers. I'll tell one other anecdote here. I once was at a conference and there was a woman there who is an executive at a very large operator in California. And I was asking her, how do you manage performance across your properties? And she pulled out her phone and pulled up a spreadsheet. And it was a stack rank of all of their properties sorted by occupancy rate. And if you were in the top third, you were green. If you were in the middle third, you were yellow. And if you were in the bottom third, you were red. And she said, basically, this is what I use, right? I spend my time with the bottom third. And there's obviously there's a lot more detail that needs to go into that. Like, were the ones in the bottom third brand new communities that were lease up? Because then you would expect them to have lower occupancy at a specific moment. But again, I share that story because that's how executives and owners may be thinking. They're busy, they're looking at their phone, they're looking at a very simplified version of performance that's top down, that's kind of reducing all of the complexity and intricacies of a community into a few specific KPIs. And then they're often doing something like just putting it in a stack rank and saying, okay, if you're at the bottom, I need to spend some time there. Net move-ins. So net move-ins is move-ins minus move-outs. So we talked earlier about occupancy. This is a really interesting one where if your sales team is doing a fantastic job in getting a lot of new move-ins, but you're also seeing a lot of move-outs, whether it's due to dissatisfaction or kind of uncontrollable things and people having to go to the hospital, having a fall, something like that, then the net move-ins may stay the same, or you may even be losing occupancy over time. So this is a really good one to keep track of, because again, it factors into a lot of other departments. So sales, if you're getting move-ins, you're getting deposits. It's new work for the clinical team. If new residents are coming in, you need to do assessments. You may be changing essentially the acuity profile of the residents, so increasing the amount of work that you need to do. From a dining perspective, if the number of residents is a little bit unpredictable, you're having to change different food profiles. And this is actually a woman on our team, Trudy Croxton, who is an executive director for 10 years, helped me prepare some of these slides. And some of these things I never would have thought of, but her point on dining, like if your residents are changing all the time, even if you stay at the same rate, they may have different dietary needs. They may have different food plans. And so that just adds complexity, and you have to change your food orders and you have to retrain the dining staff. So this kind of turnover can be really disruptive, even if your occupancy stays exactly the same. And the last piece, maintenance. Every time someone moves out, you need to turn over the unit. It's an opportunity to do the repairs that maybe you've delayed a little bit, but there's a cost to that too. And there's a time factor. How long does that unit sit unrented while you're doing the maintenance and the turnover?
Well, we have a question.
Sure.
For smaller providers who don't have an existing data system, what are the primary data elements that they should start tracking or looking at?
Yep. So there's a couple pieces. I would suggest having a CRM if you do a lot of sales. If you have kind of a smaller number of available beds and you have high occupancy, we've seen this in some areas where if you know you only have 20 beds, you may not need as much effort on a CRM. You could probably keep track of this in Excel. I would definitely recommend a chart of accounts or like accounting software. Something like QuickBooks is a great solution for smaller companies. That just allows you to keep track of your spend over time. Something like a rent roll too. Again, I don't think if you're a smaller operator, you need to go all the way to like Yardi or RealPage or something like that. There's kind of finding the right level of complexity, but you do want to be able to keep track of what's my occupancy, what are the rates that we're charging, how do those change over time? And then of course, depending on the level of care that you're providing, you may also want an electronic health record or something that allows you to track assessments, care plans, service plans, and keep an eye on that. So it kind of depends on how large your community is. There's frankly like an unlimited amount of software that you could buy if you went crazy. But for most people, I would say Excel is a really good starting place. But as you start to get bigger and more complicated, you may want to look at specific tools in those categories: CRM, accounting software, rent roll, and electronic health records. Also a payroll system. I should have mentioned that too. Everybody likes to get paid, so you should definitely use a payroll provider. Any other questions, Diana, or should I keep going?
Go ahead and keep going.
All right. So net operating income. This is now where we're starting to shift a little bit more into kind of the real estate and financial metrics. So in some cases, operators will provide bonuses to EDs and to management heads or all of the staff, depending on hitting NOI targets, or I've seen like staff retention targets. You know, if you can have 90% retention or use less agency, kind of depending on what they want. But NOI is a very specific target that EDs are often asked to achieve. And from an owner, this is really the ultimate financial metric, right? Like this answers the question for them of, are we making money on our investment? And I'm going to walk through a couple more pieces of this just to add a few more flavors. So there's a couple other kind of real estate related metrics that are very closely tied to NOI. I did a post about this, I think earlier this week or last week on LinkedIn, which goes into more detail on this. But there's a concept of a cap rate and a debt service coverage ratio. So cap rate is essentially, as an investor, what is my expected rate of return on this building? So like, how much money do I think I can make by owning this asset? And it's determined based on NOI. And the next slide, I'll go a little bit more deeper into that. The other piece is what's called a debt service coverage ratio, which is the ratio of cash flow to debt. And it measures the health of the business, which is essentially, can you pay back the debt? And so kind of taking it out of like big corporate real estate or like commercial real estate terms, if you think about it as like a home mortgage or a car loan, it's as if the bank that gave you your home mortgage knew how much money you were taking home every month. And if the bank could see that and they said, hey, we don't think you're actually making enough money to pay back the 30-year loan we gave on your home, they probably wouldn't want to continue floating that loan. The other tricky part about this is if an owner used a floating rate interest loan when they bought the property, which means that as the kind of national interest rate set by the Federal Reserve goes up, their interest rate on the loan goes up. For the past couple of years, interest rates were pretty low and pretty steady, but now they keep going up and up. So what that means is that the monthly interest payment that the owner has to make on the property is going up. So even if you had the same level of revenue, your NOI is getting smaller each month because the revenue is staying here, but the expenses are getting bigger. The amount of interest that they have to pay on their loan every month is going up. And so I've heard this a couple of times where owners are saying, we don't look at every dollar at the community, but we certainly look at every $10 or every $100. And it makes a real difference because they know that the bank that gave them the loan to buy the building is watching the debt service coverage ratio. They have to share that and report that. So it kind of gets into the next slide, which is small differences in NOI. It might not feel like a big difference when you're writing the check or when you're kind of spending the money in the moment, but to an owner, they're doing the math a little bit differently, right? So I'll give a specific example. Let's say you added $10K a month in agency expenses. On an annual basis, that's $120K of expenses. The way cap rate is calculated is basically it's a percentage, and it's a percentage of how much money do you, like, what's the rate of return that you think you're going to get. But really what you do is you take the NOI and you divide it by that percentage cap rate. So if you add 120 grand in expenses, and then you divide that by 8%, it comes out to 1.5 million. And so this is kind of an eye-opening example where like little increases in expenses or little changes in NOI on a monthly basis get amplified in a huge way. They get multiplied by 12 to become an annual expense, and then they get divided by the cap rate to change how much the building might be valued at if the owner says, hey, I want to sell this building or I need to get new investment. So it's an interesting thing that not everyone is like constantly thinking about, oh, how do I sell this building? How do I value this building? But if you're an owner, again, you're running a business. And so you're often thinking about how much is my business worth? And I share this example because I think it's relevant if you've had an experience of like wanting to spend some money or wondering why your owner or your investor or your executives might be kind of like micromanaging you on a seemingly small expense. It's because they're doing this math. And that you might think it's a small expense in an absolute sense, it's only a couple thousand or something like that. But when they do this math, it comes out to be something much, much larger in their minds. So moving into this as well, kind of talking about the expense side, controllable operating expenses, and specifically the variance between what you actually spent and what you budgeted to spend. It's really useful for essentially saying, do you understand how much money you're going to spend? One of the ways that budgeting is often useful is it's kind of a measure of how well do you understand the business. If you can accurately predict how much money you're going to spend in each category, then you can budget appropriately. And so if things like labor or utilities or maintenance go up in an unexpected way, then it shows, hey, there's something that we didn't see coming here. That's something that we should pay attention to a little bit more. All right, moving over to the HR side. This is probably the single metric that at least our customers are most interested in, which is the percentage of frontline employees who remain more than 90 days from their start date. And this metric is really interesting because it says a lot about the quality of the community experience. Are you paying enough? Are you offering a competitive kind of work environment and benefits and salary and all that stuff? And it also has kind of trickle-on effects, right? For residents, if the staff members are turning over at a very high rate, they're not building the same connection and sense of community, but also they're working with someone different frequently who may not know their preferences and may not understand their needs or who they are as a person. It's also true that, like, as an employee, if you work in an environment where your coworkers are changing all the time, that's not a great environment. And so it typically leads to job dissatisfaction. Like, if you're seeing a high rate of turnover, it's rarely an isolated thing. It's usually more of a systematic problem where you're not offering a competitive work environment that people actually want to work at and stay in long term. So this is a really good metric to keep an eye on. Labor hours by department. So essentially you take the total labor hours and then you break it out by each department. And so this is one where you're looking at your payroll system, but you're also kind of grouping it by sections. And it's really helpful to drive staffing requirements to understand essentially, like, what is the right level of workforce across my team. So that way, if you need to bring in overtime or you need to use agency to fill those gaps, you've established a baseline of here's how much we should be using for staffing, and then you know where to fill the gaps. And on the subject of agency, I know this one is top of mind for a lot of folks, but agency spend. And the reason this can be kind of tricky, and I hear this from owners a lot, is the payroll system tracks full-time employees and overtime staffing on a regular basis. Kind of every 2 weeks, you get a new pay statement. But agency, because that's not done through your regular payroll system, it might just get spent with a third-party vendor, with an agency service. And then the owner says, hey, I got the bill and I had no idea that it was going to be this much. And in their mind, they're like, oh, if I'd only known about this, I could have hired more people. I could have made changes before this really expensive agency bill landed on my desk. And again, that might be a little bit unrealistic, but there's a perception that if we could be more proactive in managing our communities, if we could find ways to solve the problem with different labor pools, with the regular labor pool, the overtime, or kind of the float staff, if you have that within your own community portfolio, then you wouldn't need to spend as much money on third party. And so I've heard from owners that they set a target of, we want every community in our portfolio to spend $0 on agency. Like, we're just not going to do it anymore. And that's kind of extreme, but it also opens up interesting questions of, okay, maybe you need to pay your employees more, right? If you don't want to spend the money over here, maybe you should spend it over here. And that way you'll have higher rates of retention, like we just talked about. People will want to take more shifts. Maybe you spend more on overtime, but that's less expensive than agency. So it's kind of a trade-off between different sources, between essentially different labor pools from an owner perspective. And then overtime. So last piece of agency, typically measured as a time and a half, so a little bit more expensive on the labor side. One second, sorry. Any questions on these KPIs before we move into kind of the last segment of the presentation? All right. So something that I want to show is this is kind of the same flow chart that we looked at earlier, and I'm going to provide this as well as the overall copy of the slides that we looked at But what this is it translates the flow chart that we looked at into an actual report that you could make. So if you're interested in being able to do this type of analysis, what you would want to do is take all the KPIs that are measured in each of these sections, line them up in a report. And so we have this kind of report blueprint that I'll share with everybody after the call, which allows you to say, okay, if I wanted to make a report like this, here are the different KPIs that I would need to measure, and here's how we can calculate them. And obviously, if you need any help with this, please feel free to reach out. My email's in the presentation as well. And this is exactly what our company is happy to help with.
Paul, we've got an interesting question before we dive in a little further. It said, years ago, I heard a stat that on average, a community starts to see a positive NOI at 86% occupancy and above. Does that feel accurate to you? If not, do you have your own high-level benchmarks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that is generally accurate. It's pretty high. And this is why owners and executives harp on occupancy so much, because if you have a high degree of occupancy, everything else kind of feels easy in that, maybe you're not using zero agency, right? Maybe you're using a little bit of agency, a little bit of overtime. You're not as precise as you need to be. There's kind of a break-even point, which is typically like mid 80%, assuming that you're charging the right rates, essentially. So if you're charging the right rates and you have that occupancy, I think that's about right. Something that I would share is, and this was a real analysis that we've done with owners coming out of COVID. The owners were saying, okay, we might say during COVID, occupancy fell to like 50, 60% or lower. So we really want to get occupancy back up to that 86%. So then they talk to their operators and they say, hey, you need to make sure that you fill up units. All we care about is move-ins. All we care about is move-ins. But what happened was the operator got the occupancy back to 86%, but the revenue and the NOI was lower than it was before. So the owner said, okay, what's going on here? And what happened was the operator offered a lot of discounts to get move-ins, because what they heard from their boss was, all I care about is move-ins. But then you wind up in a situation where you might be at 86%, but you're not making the profit margin that you were before. And even worse, you have all of these residents who committed to you for a long period. And are you going to go have a really difficult conversation with them about, hey, I need to raise your rents right after you moved in? So it's this interesting thing that we saw in the years coming out of COVID, where operators were trying to get back to where they were before COVID, but what they needed to balance between was move-ins and discounts. Because if you don't discount enough to get people to move in, then you're not going to hit your NOI goal. But if you discount too heavily and you do get a lot of occupancy, then again, you might not hit your NOI goal. So it's a really good question. The answer as always is it's complicated, but generally like mid 80% is a good benchmark for where things start to break even.
We have another one. Do you think there is a communication gap between EDs and owners on some of the staffing KPIs?
100%. So one of our kind of personal missions as a company is to create empathy for how different parts of the business think. I think that, if you're an executive director, like you're on your feet all day, you're talking to people, you're running a team, like you're the CEO of the community. If you're an owner, as I mentioned at the beginning, you're several layers removed, and it's not really people as much as it is spreadsheets, and it's a business. But the reality is like a better community is a better business. And I think we all know that and agree on that. Like if you have a place where if you're running a poor community where residents are unhappy, they're going to move out, your employees are going to quit, it's going to be more expensive, like it's a bad experience for everyone. I do think particularly on the labor side, that's an area where there could be a lot more empathy for folks. I'll tell kind of another story. Like I've heard an owner say, again, like I've heard owners be frustrated that communities are spending a lot of money on agency and they don't really understand why. And they think it's because the community leadership team just views it as like a short-term solution to a problem. It's like, oh, someone called out sick or they quit, so I have to use agency. I think that the other side of that would be if you did a little bit more to retain your employees, to incentivize them to stay, and yeah, that costs money, then maybe you wouldn't need to spend as much time on it, as much money on agency to fill those gaps. So I definitely think, and that frankly is like a big goal of this presentation, of our company's mission, is like to take these complicated, messy concepts and make sure that EDs understand how owners think, and owners understand how EDs think, and like why each person's job is hard, and then line it up so that everybody's on the same team. Any other questions that I could help with? All right, these are really good questions. So just to summarize again, here's all the KPIs that we talked about. The presentation has the definitions of them. It has all those details from there. So we'll send that out after the call if people are interested in reviewing that.
Okay, wait, one more. This one's talking about Medicaid, so this may be difficult. With Medicaid reimbursements rates as low as they are, how can we look to improve occupancy at the lower rates for our communities to get to that 80% benchmark or break even?
Yeah. So it's kind of a tricky one. If I understand the question correctly, it's with Medicaid rates low, if you're serving a Medicaid population, like how would you achieve profitability, or how would you get occupancy to where it needs to be? Is that right, Diana, or would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, that's essentially it. Like, how are you going to hit that 80% benchmark if you're relying on Medicaid rates?
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of assisted living in some areas is a premium product that's expensive and is targeted at people who can afford private pay. I know there are some states or some regulations that say a certain number of beds need to be reserved for Medicaid. I think one way that we have helped customers is if you can be better at Medicaid reimbursements, and essentially you can get paid faster, then you're able to recover that revenue. And so you're able to provide that service. So that's one way we've seen operators do this, is like be really, really prompt in filing the Medicaid reimbursement and staying on top of that and tracking that. Because if you don't get reimbursed or you're too late in filing it, it takes longer or you don't get reimbursed at all. The other answer would be looking at the controllable operating expense variance KPI, because the truth is, if you're not able to charge the rates, then you need to manage the expenses, right? It's revenue minus expenses equals NOI. And so if you're aiming for that NOI breakpoint, if you're not able to charge the rates, look at the expenses. If there are other kind of like ancillary services that some communities provide, whether it's the spa or physical therapy or different activity engagement, that's kind of another way to potentially increase your revenue outside of just the Medicaid reimbursement. But given the population that uses Medicaid, that may not be possible. But I think this is something that like the industry overall is grappling with, is a lot of assisted living is a premium product for people who can afford it. But there are certainly a lot of people who would benefit from assisted living, but may not be able to afford it. So what can we do for those folks?
Another good question. Any advice for KPIs for people just starting out? What should I watch out for to become successful? And how long should I expect to get before I should start to see a positive ROI?
Can you ask that? Well, it kind of depends what role you're sitting in. If you're an owner, if you're an executive director.
I'm assuming this person is an owner.
Is an owner?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, the thing I always say is like, you measure what matters. And so I think that the first step is like establishing a baseline. There's different things that data is good for. Data is good for answering the question, am I doing a good job today? It's also good for understanding, do I know kind of what happened yesterday? Like, can I explain these results? If I didn't hit the NOI target that I wanted to last month, was it because expenses? Was it because move outs? Was it because my employees quit? Like, do I understand? And then the next question is, being able to look into the future, can I start to predict what I believe is going to happen? So what I would say is, like, these KPIs are a good place to start. Look at your census, look at your move-ins, look at your NOI and your expenses, and look at your labor. And if you start with those, then what I would do is say, okay, how long does it take me to actually get all this data each month? Like, because it's going to take a bit of time, and you essentially have to build the muscle, like you have to build the discipline of saying, I'm going to look at all of this data every week or every month. The other thing that I think is really important to do is build a culture of looking at data, which is where, as an owner, you could say to your executive directors, look, here are the KPIs that I am most focused on because I believe they are the most important to our business. And I want to see this one go from here to here. And it's really difficult to change everything all at once. I probably wouldn't advise doing that. It's better to kind of pick one or two things and focus on them for a couple months. So you may say, I think we need to increase our occupancy. I think the place to start is we need to look at our sales conversion. Like, we're getting a lot of inquiries. Those people are taking tours, but nobody's moving in. So something is not working at the tour stage. Let's focus on that. And that would be my advice, is like, don't try to do everything all at once. I can't tell you how long it'll take, but the most important thing is like, pick a small set of things to measure and actually measure them, but like talk to your team about it as well and say, I believe we can go from here to here, and let's just chip away at that and like really understand what are the things underneath it. And I think that'll be the most effective thing for you.
Okay, we have another one here. And actually, the question is adult daycare a service that else can often increase revenue? And the answer to that question obviously is going to depend upon your state that you're located in. In Texas, it's not an easy thing to do. Basically, you're going to have a separate license.
I defer to you then, Diana. I think you know the state of Texas regulations better than anyone else on the call.
Actually, I've got Carmen on here, so
okay.
she would be our resident expert. But in a nutshell, it is something, if you're interested in exploring that, and you're one of our TALA members, please reach out to me or Carmen, and we can get you some information. And then we had one other. Clearly simple narrative stories driven by data can have tremendous impact. Your example of the impact of a 10,000K expense increase is a good example. Do you have, or does your platform calculate the impact of resident retention on NOI? For example, if we extend average length of stay by a few weeks or months, how do those seemingly small gains impact overall occupancy?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Something that I also encourage operators to think about is like, what is your business equation? So you think about it as, I have a certain number of customers, residents. I charge them a monthly fee and they stay with me for a certain number of months. That's the length of stay. And so if you think about it like that kind of a math equation, if you can make changes in any of those pieces, you're going to see more revenue. And then as an owner, when you think about that across many communities all at once, it starts to become really valuable. So an example, and this is something that we could help you calculate the ROI on, would be, okay, I'm worried about falls. Falls are the primary reason why our why our residents need to be hospitalized. So we're going to bring in a physical therapist into all of our communities to work with people on balance and stability. And I need to pay that physical therapist, and they're going to travel around and go to all my communities, but that's an expense. So I want to understand, is it worth it? So what you could do for that would be take that equation and say, I believe that this physical therapist will increase the length of stay because people won't be getting discharged to go to the hospital. And if I can measure what the length of stay was on average before using the physical therapist, and after maybe 6 months of having this person work with our residents, do I feel like the ROI is there to justify the expense of paying the physical therapist? So I think it's, and again, this was the kind of like empathy for different positions. If you can kind of put a business hat on and say, like, what is the equation of senior living? Then you can start to think about, if I can make these improvements in length of stay, if I can make these improvements in our inquiry to move-in ratio, if I can achieve higher rents or provide better services or other services, how can I make this work for me? And then you can spend more money on the expenses, you can pay your employees more, you can provide more premium services. There's lots of different things, but you have to kind of figure out how to make it work from a business perspective as well.
Now, so I'm in my answer on adult day. So the separate license answer is if you're intending to have like a situation where you've got a large number of people coming in on a daily basis. You can offer respite to individuals coming in daily, but that goes to your license number. So if you're licensed with the state for 60, and you've got 50 people in there, then you only have 10 availables that you would be able to do respite. And the big thing is you're basically treating that person as if you are bringing them into your community as an assisted living resident. You have to have a bed for them. And we've had discussions with the agency about this issue and being able to better serve a respite population. But at this point in time, they're basically it's almost like you're admitting them as an assisted living resident. If you want to do some type of operation that is different from that, then that requires a separate license. You have all these requirements about the building, separation and stuff. Oh, another good question for you, Paul. How do you calculate employee retention?
Yeah. So there's a couple different ways of doing this. And this is actually something that we do a couple. So the way we do it is we look at the employees that are still employed like a certain amount of time after their start date. So you could look at it like 90 days or 180 days is usually kind of a good benchmark for once someone has been with you for that long, if they stayed with you for 90 days, like they're likely to stick around for a good amount of time. And this is where it's helpful. There's kind of two sides of the same coin. There's retention and turnover. So turnover is the people who quit, retention is the people who stay. And we find that looking at retention is more helpful because then you can drill into that group of employees and say, is there anything unique about these people? Did we find them, through a certain recruiting event? Did they have a different job interview experience? Did they come from a different background? That can be useful. The other thing that we do to get more granular on retention metrics is we can cohort employees into different groups depending on seniority or department. So a couple different things that we do for our customers are like looking at community management turnover and frontline turnover separately. So your ED and your department heads versus your CNAs and kind of your frontline employees. And the thesis there was basically, if you have stability with your community leadership, that may create a more positive environment for employees because they report to the same boss. Their boss has a lot of experience, can teach them, can coach them. But there's lots of different ways to slice and dice this. That's something where if you reach out to me, I'm happy to give you a preview of all the different ways that we do it. But this is a good example of like measuring retention on a rolling basis is pretty hard because you have to look at the payroll statements every 2 weeks and figure out who's still employed and then look back in time and say, okay, was this person employed 90 days ago? It's a really good problem for computers, frankly, to do, like with something like our software or another tool, because then you don't have to do all this analysis by hand.
Any more questions? And Paul, I want to say, I think this is probably the most questions we've had in a TALAHour. So congratulations.
I love it. These are all great questions.
You sparked a lot of really great discussion.
Oh, good.
If we have any other questions, Paul, you have any wrap-up comments? Oh, we got an excellent presentation, excellent presenter.
Thank you. I appreciate that. No, I mean, I think one of the questions kind of teed me up for my wrap-up comments, which is I think it's really important for everyone to understand and have empathy for how the other side thinks. And I think for executive directors, understanding that owners are running a business. And I think for owners, understanding that executive directors are also running a business, but they're face-to-face with the customer and they're face-to-face with the employees. Like they're not a spreadsheet. It's just a very different reality. But I think that if we can all communicate using the same terms and understand the motivations of each side, it ultimately builds a better business and a better industry and a better experience for employees and residents and owners. And like, that's really what we're driving towards with this conversation.
Also, I want to thank everybody for attending in June, in the latter part of June, and we're probably going to do this. I know we usually do our TALA hours on Friday. We're probably going to do this one on a Wednesday or Thursday. Carmen Tilton, TALA's VP of Public Policy, is going to be doing a legislative session wrap up on some of the things, let you know what passed, what didn't pass. Well, we will see some new training requirements around those that are serving folks with Alzheimer's or related disorders. That is one piece of legislation that did pass. But she will be on the lookout for that, so you can get registered for those. They'll probably be going out in the next week or so. And then in July, on July 14th, Lori Tamayo, who's a consultant here in Texas, is got a great presentation she's going to be doing on cybersecurity. Many businesses, including small businesses, have been seeing ransomware attacks. And so she's got a really great presentation on cybersecurity and some steps and stuff that you need to make sure you're doing. We have one final question, Paul. I don't know if you're going to be able to
Always
get in on this. We've gotten a couple more excellent comments and great presentations, but on the owner side, how do you value an out for purchase sale? That may be a bit too much for you to choose, but I'll give it.
Well, that's where you look at a couple different things. So you look at like essentially what is the historical performance of the community, not just the occupancy, but what is the NOI that it's been able to achieve. And that's where that concept of cap rate comes in. That's how real estate owners view basically, if I spend $1 million, how much am I going to get back in a year? And assisted living, because it's more complicated than like buying an apartment complex, the risk is higher and that there's more operationally complex stuff. You have to get a license, you have to employ people in a different way, but the potential return is higher too. So what they do look at is the performance of that asset over time, the performance of other communities in the area. They look at demographics. So they might say, frankly, like, are there a lot of wealthy seniors in this area? Are there hospitals in this area that could be good referral partners or like good partners in a health system? They look at competition. So they would say, are there a lot of other ALFs already in the area that it may be saturated, like there's too much choice for a consumer, or maybe if all of those are really high end, we could offer something that's a little bit cheaper. So it's a complicated look, but generally like historical performance is the most interesting thing. Or they may say, like, we think the old owner did a bad job and we think we could do better if we change some things around.
Well, Paul, thank you so much. That was really great information. We really appreciate you. And thank you for being one of our industry partners and for always coming to our conference. We really appreciate it. And everyone, thank you for joining us for TALAHour today. As soon as the cloud uploads the recording, I'll get the recording and the presentation out to you. And I hope everyone has a wonderful Memorial Day weekend and stay safe out there.
Well, thank you, Diana. Thank you, everybody.